The Constitution of the United States guarantees the ability of the civilian population to seek the government for remedy, and thus has the compulsion automatically for the courts to compel Congress to recognize David's title for the duel, which generates the obligation immediately to recognize their obligations and their oaths of office to defend the Constitution from the Confederate insurrectionists, which, having targeted David for sedition, are seeking the eradication of the United States as they cut it to pieces and sell it for portions, guaranteeing the full dismantlement for profits, which they were already paid for with their deals with the devil on how to acquire extraordinary wealth according to their own mortal incompetence when they committed treason, taking payments to overthrow the government by their insurgency, hyper accelerated by their voter fraud promoted by the Confederate insurrection to destroy the United States and overthrow its government, permanently barring all authority or oversight by the civilian government over the Confederate military forces and its unprofessional phantom cells, which includes the max generation of the cartels and the other parties who were provided as proxy war militia forces promoted by the drug trade and gun trade and other dangerous prohibited activities, which is founded for their fake freedom fighters to be called on maturity terrorists, at which point the exponential creation of the problem in order to solve the problem to destroy those that had assisted them in the point of origin when it was necessary creates the position of a systems of theft and betrayal and backstabbing and intrigue. And this system of absolute removal of all safety through anarchy is their cornerstone belief in their liberty from God and country, and the form of anarchy, stating in their neo-slavery degeneracy that the only rule is that there are no rules, and thus the mechanism of those who wish to infiltrate it for the express purpose of restraining their evil is viewed with absolute hatred and contempt, and the inevitability of their assassination is a predetermined conclusion. To support these demoniac freaks is an act of suicide for all time. If there is a God, they are devoted to hell as his enemy, exclusively and for the purpose of itself. You cannot call them human. It would be a functional refusal to define things according to themselves, and thus the mechanism requires this arrangement that they, having removed all forms of law, are not to be considered people according to the law, and thus they are not human according to religious constructs of the definition of those that would be viewed with any redeeming qualities as to be called amongst the humane as opposed to the barbaric, degenerate, wild, animalistic, and unsustainable greed for the sake of its own consumption. To this extent, the mindless evil that is supporting those surveillance terrorist operations, including but not limited to the targeted individuals for kidnapping to be defamed by the kidnappers, who create in its entirety the function of their defamation from a simulation of an abuse theater, which then generates their being tainted for the general public as they engage in all kinds of ritual spells in order to guarantee the minimizing effects of that person in the general society, seeking permanent injuries as a form of war becomes acknowledged as strictly prohibited or not to be tolerated, which is only gotten as far as it has through the seditions that it has targeted the American government for in its war against the American government as enemy combatants without a legal government. Under the American law, each party must be recognized at the time of each of the cases. To this extent, the functional time of the kidnappings or the surveillance tamperings, which the Confederates would seek to defraud the courts by obstructing key pieces of evidence, including the function of the destruction of evidence as a hate group, engaging in fraudulent activities for the express purpose of that war, would then manipulate the function, pretending to do one job while they are doing an entirely separate job, and thus the function of mixing policies in order to acquire the position is no longer the derivative of any of the protected qualities, having disqualified itself on examination, and thus is not an assumed position, and thus the exponential increase of the unionized protections would have inherently been generated for the express purpose of protecting them from these standard violations as a act of treason by the Confederate insurrectionists, seeking the function of each normalized position from the sedition, creating de facto policy by the violation when they have frozen the enforcement mechanism against the laws that they are breaking. And thus, without law enforcement, there is no de facto way for the person to be punished for it, at which point the flagrant criminals continue to do so flagrantly as an advanced form of insurrection, and thus in this action engage in that function for the express purpose of military operations against the American government, dismantling American hegemony, as the deal with the devil exponentially corrupts and collapses the system, and thus anyone who is allowed into those positions increasingly is obligated to be devoted to that corruption of taking the payment to overthrow the government for the insurrectionists, which is an act of treason. Secret equipment derivative for military operations being used against the civilian population, breaching the Second Amendment limitation, generates the position of compelled speech, such as voice control, which engages in the function of compelled speech or compelled bodily action, such as movement, farting, shitting yourself, peeing yourself, vomiting, or any number of other embarrassing functions which would automatically be generated for the intimidation as low-grade blackmail, engaging in the function of advanced reality TV for the entertainment of the deranged, which normalize this automated payment fluctuated by its resources by that black market and its various ways of profiting off of that reality TV generates the permanent state of war or anarchy as the function of law has been fully nullified or been made the enemy itself as they have criminalized evidence against their activities, generating the position for their retaliations, which then purges it from the record, which then subsequently changes the entire narrative of each of the engagements, subsequently engaging in the activity of their warfare as they craft their various illusions. These are exclusively and with no variations hate crimes. The function is insurrection as a form of warfare by a hate group doing hate crimes for military functions as phantom cell military operations by an unprofessional militia, generating the resources of having tapped into the American government to fund their overthrow of the government in the name of lawlessness. And to this end, the First Amendment, the right to a remedy, Benjamin Plenner cover. Scholars and jurists agree that the First Amendment's right to petition the government for a redress of grievances includes a right of court access, but narrowly defines the right to file a lawsuit. This dominant view fails to meaningfully differentiate between the right to petition, the freedom of speech, and due process, missing the distinct significance of the petition clause, which individual petition courts. The most significant threat of the court's access today occurs after the filing stage, enforcing a mandatory arbitration provision or an exhaustion requirement, granting an official qualified or absolute immunity from suit, or drastically reducing the damages awarded pursuant to the stationary cap. By defining court access too narrowly, the prevailing theory of the right to petition renders the First Amendment silent on the face of its threats. The article fills this gap in First Amendment theory by presenting the first systematic account of the right to petition the court that expands the concept of court access from the procedural forum access to substantive remedial access, guaranteeing the right of a legal injury person to obtain a meaningful remedy. The remedial theory best accounts for the history, text, and precedent of the petition clause as a historical matter. This theory grants force from the inside of the First Amendment. Right to petition is the best understood as merger of English right to petition and the English right to remedy. These antecedent rights controlled. These antecedent rights controlled. Petitioning practice directed at different institutional actors, but when these petitions were legal in nature, there was a sharpened expectation that the relief, where warranted, would follow from a textual perspective. The remedial theory gives the petition clause meaning independent of the speech clause, and it explains why the framers expanded the petition clause recipient subclause from the legislator to the governor. Jurisprudentially, the theory garners a perhaps surprising degree of support from both early and modern Supreme Court precedent. This theory could translate naturally into a tried scrutiny doctrine framework for remedial access claims, which are more differential review from the neutral time, place, and manner, providing the heightened scrutiny when the remedial burdens are based on the contents of the lawsuit, the identity of the plaintiff, or the defendant's governmental status. And these types of constructs generate the obligation of the courts to compel Congress to recognize David Bowles at the time of the kidnapping from the illegal surveillance, which they seek to protect for the overthrow of the government as an act of insurrection, disqualifying them from Congress, and thus inherently encourages them to deny the obligation to provide the access to the government in order to file for the remedy, and thus the ability to engage in that obligation is mandatory under the Constitution, which they have sworn an oath of office to defend, which generates the obligation to uphold, and thus the enforcement of that acknowledgement, despite the obstructed information guarantees the obligation that in this action they are engaged in either an act of war against the United States government or are obligated by the law to engage in the remedy action of the duel, which acknowledges David's obstructed status, which they sought to cut the roots out of by their white supremacist communism contracts, which are illegal and must be restored against all injuries, and to this end and function generates the perpetuity of the contract schedule that they were well aware of, labeling David Bowles as the aristocracy, which would have subverted their capacity to engage in the voter fraud, allowing them to engage in the function of getting elected. And thus, the action of the voter fraud, having disqualified themselves, creates a state of exponential emergency, as he is the aristocracy and is the primary source or cornerstone to the function of the vote. And to this end, their obligation to have dedicated David Bowles to national security, claiming that he would have to do so in order for him to become apolitical, would require them to engage in the offer, which creates the position of the intelligence oversight at the top rank general, in order to match the insurmountable value of their estimated status for him, in order for David to have accepted it, otherwise it would have been rejected. To this extent, they acknowledge in the record, which they are obligated to formally recognize as the starting value from that position, either disqualifies them for voter fraud or acknowledges David as intelligence oversight as the top ranked general, guaranteeing his latitude and his control over his specific limitations on what he is or is not allowed to do, which they estimated would have hyper accelerated his support for the general rights of the civilian population, as it would be easier to do oversight from informants in the general public, requiring them to have the latitude to make these substantive support, and the information generated for these substantive supports would then be classified and yada 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 yada, but David would not receive any of the normal limitations, and this being a necessary exchange in favor of the limitation of David becoming apolitical as opposed to a military participant who, having the power of the aristocracy, would be the primary elector, which functionally becomes the uncomfortable subject of a mixing of branch authorities, and that being the objective would then generate the obligation for David's brokerage, which he would have been born with according to the theory which they targeted in the cutting of the roots so that he would not have his resources immediately, which would have been supported by the fully functioning corporations which would have sustained him. Thus, the action of his butler, who would have had all of those things put together and would have been managing everything as his attendant or samurai before his birth, generating the normalization of his extraordinary wealth to this position, acknowledging his trained and absolute precise capabilities in that superiority function, generates the subversion to all of the presumed weaknesses, and this being understood compels them to have made the intelligence oversight department for David before he was born alongside those functions, in order for it to have been crafted and specifically tailored to their presumption of his taste, according to that legend, which goes back as far as it does, as each of the structural functions requires an anticipation of things before then in time, generating an obligation for structure from investment, which would have automatically triggered generating their obligation to have told the general public the particular essential functions for its existence, generating the classified function of David's historical wealth according to this function, which should have been protected from the Confederates, which had been released for the express purpose of their strategic advancement in the destruction of the United States concerning modern warfare. And thus, and thus, and thus, with intelligence oversight powers having thoroughly dismantled the function of the Confederate operations from the Black Hats, would have been able to conduct the law enforcement that they targeted for the sedition so that they could gain the de facto policies in the absence of the legal government, generating a series of precedents off of fraud which had to have been corrected by the law in this acknowledgement, generating the pretenses. Thus, the act of Congress having its official enforcement mechanism and education structure for the function of the normalizing of the military police specialized for that role under David's control generates the normal capacity to have enforced against what others have systemically taken advantage of in its absence, such as, but is not limited to, the president ignoring congressional orders, stating things similar to the form of, "You have made your decree, now enforce it," asserting their dereliction for duty and contempt derivative of the checks and balances, acknowledging Congress as the superior authority, which is fundamental to the Confederates' overthrow of the United States, which had to first compromise the president, promising unlimited power to the president for these formats to have disconnected the checks and balances function, which is then usurped by the inferiors who have infiltrated it for the white supremacists, which generates the pretense of the full bore coup, which they would have practiced exponentially throughout history on other nations in order to have guaranteed that this time would have been perfect, and thus the mechanism of winning by indirect combat, by systems of fraudulent theories which amount to direct dereliction of duty and contempt for the law, and contempt for the various offices derivative by the law, and to this extent are exclusively treason on its face. And to that end, they do not functionally have an argument or a theory, they just have an insatiable desire, greed, lust, passion, for the eradication of American law and hegemony, systemically corrupting every aspect of society and the government until the position has consumed the entirety of the host, until the parasite is the only thing left by which it then can breed and distribute itself towards the other infected functions, radicalizing the other phantom cells as they conquer the world by their invisible empire in favor of their satanic one world government, such as the special form of Jews which have been chosen by the Confederates in order to portray the rest of their Jews as a false front or cover with aggressive tendencies, which engages in the use of bluster in order to defend itself, and thus eradicates the function of the religious Jew in favor of the atheistic Jew, which then engages in the function of making the revelation as a obligation, which normalizes the destruction of the religious Jew, which is fundamentally their core construct. The mass sacrifice of those that they view as legitimately Jews is fundamental to their new religion. And this, having been hyper-accelerated by the Confederates, generates a fake Christianity which has viewed itself as needing to have acquired these positions in order to compel the function of the creation of revelation, so that they can engage in their delusional activities, asserting their superiority and false motives, as many become so deluded that they forget what their original purpose was when engaging in this activity. Now, these delusions are generated by the illusionary state of their real God, which is functionally the D&D Frazzo and his companion demon lords. And to this extent, you have the Lord of Deception, which has normalized the function of their inherent attraction to abuse, which claims, similar to the function of in Immaculate, the movie, that pain is love. And the hyper exaggeration of all of the dopamine advantages, similar to the function of meth, engages in the hyper luxuries, which exponentially become insatiable in its capacity to make everything just the best in imagination. And this goes on for days upon days upon days until they completely deplete their dopamine, in which case they engage in their hyper crash and the inevitability of their being consumed by their demon lord for the advantage of their drug filled advantages and enjoyments compels their immediate destruction, and thus to be consumed by the very idea which they worship, as they are given to the strong delusion and eaten.